This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Asian Insider, and this is Ravi Velloor. My guest today is Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump. Today, I intend to tap Ambassador Bolton for his views on Mr. Trump's policy towards Asia. And I'm talking to him a few days after news emerged that the U.S. has told Taiwan President Lai Ching-te that he is not welcome to a stopover in New York. Mr. Trump has also made extremely disparaging remarks about India this week. Welcome to Asian Insider, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador, we're now 6 months into the second Trump administration. And before I ask you about his approach to Asia this time, could I ask you to talk a little bit about what it was like to work with him so closely in those 17 months? You were his longest-serving national security advisor.
Right. Well, as I said in my book, working in the White House was like living inside a pinball machine. Trump doesn't have a strategy. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't really even do policy the way most people understand the term. He doesn't make decisions in what I at least consider an orderly fashion, assembling the evidence, considering the options, weighing the pros and cons. He makes quick decisions and he's quick to reverse himself. He thinks that international relations can be seen largely through the prism of whether he's friends with foreign leaders or not friends with them. So up until the last 6 months, he considered Vladimir Putin a friend. Maybe he doesn't anymore. He considers Xi Jinping a friend. When he first met with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, he came away from that meeting and said, "We fell in love." So that's how he sees things. And therefore, when you try to pursue what I would consider sort of normal policy development, he just doesn't operate on that wavelength.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, what was his attitude towards Asia in his first term? Your book did give some insights on his personal relationships with President Xi and Kim Jong-un of North Korea, as you just mentioned. But did those personal fancies affect American policy towards Asia, or was it said that there are always adults in the room like you to sort of steady the ship?
Well, I don't think he had a policy toward Asia, but don't feel badly because he didn't have a policy toward Europe either, or the Western Hemisphere, or the Middle East. He treats things in a very transactional, ad hoc, episodic manner. I said in my book, in his first term, he made thousands and thousands of decisions, a great many of which, I'm sure a majority of which I agreed with, but I described them as a vast archipelago of dots out there. You can try and connect the dots if you want to, but he couldn't even connect them on any given day. So that's why these personal relationships, for example, he had an excellent relationship with Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, and in part because Abe worked on it so hard. He'd call him all the time. He'd play golf with him, so that when something came up that was really important to Abe, he had a relationship to fall back on when he talked to Trump about it.
Mm-hmm. I know you mentioned Shinzo Abe, but in your own book, I do remember that you did say that while Abe managed to get his way around Trump, there actually were tense moments in that relationship when he brought up Pearl Harbor or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's just bizarre. I don't know how to describe it, but in at least one meeting in the White House where I was there, we were actually talking about Korea and the difficulty of having South Korea and Japan cooperate on military matters on the Korean Peninsula for a lot of reasons of history on the Korean side, at least under President Moon Jae-in. And Trump, as he often does, started off rambling away and said, Shinzo's father was a kamikaze pilot, and he was very disappointed he didn't get to succeed in carrying out one of his missions. Just ignoring the fact, of course, if he had succeeded, there wouldn't be a Shinzo Abe sitting across the table from him. And Abe and others on the Japanese side, I must give them great credit for patience and displaying a poker face, because they just sat there and listened to it and hoped the moment would pass. Much like Keir Starmer in Scotland a few days ago, listening to Trump over an hour-long Q&A session where Starmer, as somebody said, it looked like it was the 1,000-yard stare. He just didn't pay any attention to what Trump was saying.
Oh, the Brits can do that very well. Ambassador, could we talk about Trump 2.0 or version 2? Now, he's returned with a very strong mandate. Does this Trump have a broad approach to Asia? And what is that approach?
Well, I don't think he does have a broad approach toward Asia, although I think there are many people in his administration who have their own views on Asia. And because of the near total collapse of the National Security Council coordination mechanism, are sometimes off taking actions with or without general agreement as to what they're doing. That doesn't necessarily represent Trump's approach. It represents their approach. And as any number of ambassadors in Washington have said to me, they can't figure out who to talk to other than Trump himself, which ambassadors rarely do. And they don't want to have their head of state or head of government calling Trump all the time. But there's just real uncertainty what the direction is. I think overwhelmingly, Trump looks at the international trade question as the most important issue for him. And I don't mean to say the trade is not important. Obviously, it is for everybody's economic well-being. But I think Trump focuses on it because he thinks he understands it. He sees dollars and cents, and he thinks he knows what that means. So for him, the geopolitical questions, strategic issues, I think very definitely have taken a back seat to what are still, in many cases, unresolved issues about trade.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I think he likes to see himself as a tariff man or whatever he calls himself. But Ambassador, we in Singapore were quite startled that he should have hit us with tariffs. As you know, the U.S. runs a trade surplus with Singapore, and the fact that he should have hit us with tariffs has completely left us shocked. Do you personally approve of the tariffs, Ambassador?
I don't approve of the general drift of the policy behind the tariffs. I think free trade is a good thing. That's that you start with that. And I think the U.S. successfully pursued that policy since 1945 with a lot of bumps in the road. But the statistics by economists before Trump took office in January were that the average global tariff against American goods coming into foreign countries was in the range of 2 or 3%. And the average American tariff on goods coming into our country was 2 to 3%. So pretty low all the way around. And what Trump has done just so far is raise tariffs to a level comparable to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. Now, the world economy is very different, but the harm that's going to be caused is going to be significant. People have said in the United States, well, we had good growth in the second quarter, but if you look in the first half of this year, it's an annual growth rate of 1.9%, which is ridiculous. We could have a much stronger economy where there's not all this uncertainty about tariffs and not just the rates of tariffs, but the way Trump has conducted this on one day, off the next day, up, down. He doesn't like what the president of Brazil is doing to his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. Tariffs go up. He doesn't like that Canada has said it would recognize Palestine. That's going to affect the trade negotiations there. I do think there are issues in international trade to be addressed. I do think there are countries that, whether through tariffs or non-tariff barriers, do block American exports. The way you clarify those situations is by negotiation. And if they fail, then you can consider retaliatory steps. You don't go to trade war with the entire world. I think that this is a good indication of how Trump really doesn't understand international trade the way he thinks he does. He has said expressly that trade surpluses and trade deficits are like profits and loss for a country. I don't know of any sensible economist anywhere, even Marxist economist, who believe that's true. It ignores almost everything we've learned about comparative advantage and really is just so out of whack with reality, it's hard to discuss it. There are trade anomalies. That's fine. There are ways to deal with them, number one. Number two, there are some national security issues where, with the United States, for example, has had products manufactured in China enter into its supply chain for defense procurement. Maybe that was done at a time when we were more naive. It's time to get that changed. I do think national security is a limited focus. Not everything is national security, because if everything is, then nothing is. Mm-hmm. So I consider that a limited category. And then finally, there's one major problem in international trade today, and that's China. It has stolen intellectual property for decades. It subsidizes its companies in international competition. It's not fully opened its markets. But the way you deal with pressuring China to change its practices is you get your allies together and you all join in. You don't declare war against everybody, including China, and hope that you're going to come to the right result. So bottom line is I'm very worried about both the economic consequences of what Trump has done and the political and diplomatic consequences. People around the world think we've lost our mind, basically, that we're ripping aside, shredding decades of effort to get better relations, to develop trust and good faith and reliance with countries that we're now treating, as in the case of Singapore, as if they're adversaries, when obviously they're not.
Right. Ambassador, I've heard you say that Trump is an aberration of American political life. But in Asia, the view is growing that America has changed forever, that the U.S. is tired of overseas interventions and there's weariness with foreign policy. What do you say, sir?
No, I don't think that's right. I do think Trump is an aberration. It's true he won the presidency twice. He ran against pitifully inadequate and unpopular opponents on 2 of his 3 tries. And I think that while a lot of what he's done is not met with opposition within the Republican Party, it's not because the views of members of Congress have changed. They're just intimidated by him. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's not a good thing. But there is hidden good news there, is that people haven't changed their minds. They're just afraid to speak up. But I think this battle is going to go on through the rest of Trump's term. If the economy suffers negative effects in the second half, which I think it almost certainly will, you're going to see the politics change. We go into a congressional midterm election next year, and a lot of Republicans will do what they have to do to protect themselves in office, even if that means bucking Trump.
Right. What about all this talk that Trump believes in spheres of influence, and for that reason might be just about quite happy to see China run Asia? Do you believe it?
That's too complicated for Trump. I think he sees everything on a kind of one-off basis. What he's focusing on now, a very interesting development, is having tariffed India at a very high rate. His final decision is 25%, plus maybe more to come because of purchases of Russian oil. His original proposal had been 26%, so he didn't change much. Still has a decision on what to do about China. And many people are worried he's going to tilt toward China away from India. I don't think that's because he thinks China ought to have a sphere of influence that includes India. I think he really wants to make the biggest trade deal in history with Xi Jinping. He thought he could do that in his first term, but it never happened. And, he is fascinated with China. I told the story in my book when he had lunch with Theresa May at Chequers in 2018. And he told her about his trip to China in 2017. And he said, they gave me the biggest welcome they have ever given any foreign leader in Chinese history. And, we just sat there thinking, how do you respond to that? But he'd love to go back to China and get an even bigger welcome from the Chinese government.
Right. What did you make of the Trump administration just telling Taiwan President Lai Ching-te that he's not welcome to stop over in New York?
I think that's a severe mistake. I think is one of the pieces of evidence that a number of Asia hands really have commented on to show a softening of Trump's view on China, at least in many people's mind. The transiting of Taiwanese presidents through American airports has long been a custom. I've, over the years, received many calls from Taiwanese presidents sitting in an airport lounge somewhere on their way to Latin America. And to make this change now sends exactly the wrong signal to Beijing, and I'm afraid to the Taiwanese people, who are very worried about what may be coming.
Right. Do you know, Ambassador, at one level, there seems to be American retrenchment from Asia. But on the other hand, Trump seems to like to get involved. He claimed credit for ending the India-Pakistan war, and now he's told Thailand and Cambodia to cool things down. What does one make of these contradictory impulses?
He desperately wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wanted it in his first term. He saw that Barack Obama got one in his first year. He didn't think Obama deserved it. By the way, I agree on that. Obama hadn't done anything in the first year to deserve it.
Right.
But Trump thinks he should get one. So he's now been saying he's brought peace somewhere at the rate of once a month since he's been inaugurated. Rwanda, Congo, Serbia, Kosovo, they stopped the war there, which surprised everybody in Serbia and Kosovo that didn't know they were at war. The India-Pakistan thing has irritated a lot of people in India who think actually they in Pakistan climbed down from the crisis caused by the attack in Kashmir. It goes on, but that's how Trump sees things. He calls people up, and like Thailand and Cambodia, which have been struggling over this particular temple and a whole range of other issues for couple centuries now. He says, you fix this up so we can have a trade deal. And they get a trade deal, and it just proves what a peacemaker he is.
Right. Ambassador, could I ask you about Trump and the three big Asian powers, China, Japan, and India? Can you detail what he's doing with each of these and what he's getting right and where he's going wrong? Could we begin with China?
Yeah, on China's economic policies, I think he is correct in saying they have taken advantage of their membership in the World Trade Organization. They've really transformed the organization in some sense, and they're not agreeing to the commitments they make. They're continuing to engage in industrial espionage. Their companies like Huawei and ZTE are not telecoms companies, they're arms of the Chinese state. And I do think that Trump at some level understands the threat that China poses in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But when you talk to him about, for example, the Asian Security Quad, which was one of Shinzo Abe's ideas, one of his priorities in meetings with Abe and Modi in the first term and the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, at that point, whether bilaterally or in the rare occasions when the Quad got together, all Trump wanted to talk about was trade. And the effort to bring India in particular into closer coordination with Japan, Australia, and others in the region. I mean, I think I could see the Quad expanding to bring in South Korea, Singapore, others. You just couldn't get Trump's attention. He does not think strategically. I think he believes he has a good relationship with the Prime Minister of Japan. I think he thought he had a good relationship with Modi in India, but that doesn't appear to be working out if this trade decision is any indication. And it just shows a lack of coherence. Again, I would say there are people in the administration who have their own views, the Defense Department in particular, but that they're not necessarily indicative of what Trump believes.
Is that so? Ambassador, so is it fair to say now that AUKUS and Quad are pretty much dead in the water? I mean, was Wang Yi right all along when he called it foam on the oceans, when he referred to the Quad as foam on the oceans? And American foreign policy under Trump, Elbridge Colby has just asked for a review of AUKUS. What does one make of all this? I mean, are these things to be forgotten as long as Mr. Trump is around?
No, I don't think so. Things could change very quickly. I do think the Quad was moved forward. I mean, really, the idea was originated back in about 2005, 2006, but it was Abe who tried to give it life. And his passing is a very sad event for a lot of reasons, but you need somebody who appreciates the strategic significance of it. So I'm not optimistic much more will happen on the Quad, especially given where we are now on the trade issue between India and the United States. Look, I think AUKUS, I was stunned that the Biden administration agreed to a deal involving producing perhaps 10 to 12 nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. I think it was the right thing to do. It would be a catastrophe for the United States to abandon it. There is an issue of what our own shipbuilding capacity is. We're going to need replacement submarines, and so will the British. The answer to that is increase our domestic production capability and build more, not just for Australia, but for others. I could imagine an AUKUS kind of relationship with Japan on a number of defense-related issues, possibly South Korea as well. This is part of a long-term effort, should be part of a long-term effort to build relationships that are strategically oriented all across the Indo-Pacific. I'm not advocating creating NATO all at once. It's a very different environment. So let's try a lot of different things and see what works and matures. That is not what we're doing now. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, is there any chance at all that Mr. Trump and President Xi Jinping might do a big deal, a grand bargain, as some people believe, Trump is capable of doing? And if they did that, what would be the contours of that grand bargain?
Well, I think Trump wants to do the biggest trade deal in history with China. He used to talk that way in his first term. People thought his campaign rhetoric against China showed he really was going to take a hard line, but that was motivated because he believes he lost the 2020 election because of COVID. There is an argument to that. The economic hit that we all took because of COVID upset a pretty vibrant U.S. economy, and he blames COVID on China coming out of the laboratory at Wuhan. But of course, he didn't lose the 2020 election. It was stolen. But if it hadn't been stolen, and if it hadn't been for China, he would have won. But nonetheless, the thought of standing in Tiananmen Square, signing the biggest trade deal in human history and getting another wonderful welcome from China, it's just too much for him to resist. And I'm afraid that non-trade issues could be part of that deal. They worry about that in Taiwan. What does it mean when Trump and Xi do get together? Are they going to be on the table? And I think it's right for them to be worried.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, final question for you. What would you advise Mr. Trump on Asia, assuming you had his ear again?
Well, that's not very likely, but I would say he needs to focus on the threat posed by China, the threat of China's increasing efforts to establish hegemony along its periphery, really all the way from Japan to India. And we saw the impact, for example, in this flare-up between India and Pakistan, where the Pakistanis were using fifth-generation Chinese fighters and using them to great advantage. So it's a potentially very unstable relationship. I think the nations of the Indo-Pacific would like a greater American presence. We don't live there. We don't have any aspirations as China does, I think. But we're not approaching it coherently. The trade question has dominated everything. I think we're missing a lot of opportunities. And I think we're alienating a number of people who would like to come closer to the United States, but with this erratic behavior, unpredictability, uncertainty over trade and other things, they live in the neighborhood. They're going to have to make accommodations with China, which might be difficult to reduce down the road. So it's a very concerning period. I just hope our friends in Asia continue to press the case in Washington, because there are a lot of people who just disagree with Trump. And I think getting up-to-date information and suggestions from leaders in the region is going to be very important over the next 3.5 years.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador John Bolton, for coming on Asian Insider.
Well, thanks again for having me.
And that's a wrap for Asian Insider. I'm Ravi Velloor. This podcast was produced and edited by Faiza Sunny. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. If you'd like to read my articles, we have links in our podcast show notes below.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.